Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Shop Talk, hosted by the Triangle Area SQL Server Users Group. 2024 has started, and this is the first episode of Shop Talk in the new year. So, welcome in. Normally, this would be a place where you kick back after work and we talk a little bit of SQL Server and other data platform technologies. Hopefully, not many of you have had to work today. So, this is going to be kick back after a day of not work and talk a little bit about SQL Server and data platform technologies. So, if this is your first time at Shop Talk, welcome. The general premise is this is definitely a chat-driven environment. If you have questions, you want to talk about a particular topic, bring it up, and we will pontificate and sometimes even have good answers. That happens once every few episodes. In the meantime, I have joined with me the one and only Mala. How you doing, Mala?
Good evening, everyone, and Happy New Year to you all.
Yeah, Happy New Year. So, we've got a few things to talk about. But again, if you have questions, you have something you want us to have off the cuff, possible rants talking about, get them in chat. First thing I do want to mention, and I will send out an email to the broader TriPass audience, but TriPass election results. So we had our election for two of the positions, the ones held by Mike Christensen and Tracy Baggiano. Those were up for re-election. I convinced, connived, and otherwise manipulated them into running again. And they have won in North Korean election style. So 100% of the vote said, yes, we want them back. So that's good. So our board will basically be the same as it was the last year. I'm glad for that. Mike and Tracy have both done a really great job as members of the TriPass board, and look forward to seeing them again, hopefully in future episodes of Shop Talk, as well as doing the other things that they do. One of the things actually Tracy has been doing is getting all of the user group meetings planned out for the upcoming year. And I know that she has already got most of the main meetings set up and has some of the advanced DBA and data scientist ones. But if you have a topic that you want to talk about, especially for the advanced DBA or for the data science subgroups, the ones that meet on the second Tuesday and the fourth Tuesday of each month, respectively, then our call for speakers is still open. So I'll drop a link to that in chat here. And if you're interested, you can check out that call for speakers and submit a session or four. So with that little bit of advertisement out of the way, our first real topic of the night. And this one comes from Mala. So the gist of it is SQL Server getting to be an old or a less exciting product? And the impetus around this was that you see some of the people in the SQL Server community, Ryan Bowes or Grant Fritchie or Brent Ozar, have been spending more time working with Postgres lately versus SQL Server. And so I think it's an interesting topic. And Mala, do you want to add anything to the preface for this or dive right in?
Um, all I have to add is I can see where some of them are coming from. Like they've blogged and worked extensively on the product, and they've looked at it, from many different angles, and they probably reached a point, a certain gap in what they can do there creatively. And I get that, and I think part of SQL Server is that it's a pretty mature product that it is now. I don't. I'm not a fan of just adding exciting stuff to something just to make it cooler or
Mm-hmm.
whatever it is. I think it's a good product. It's a stable product, and it's been doing that. I can see why they want to perhaps think of doing something else in that regard. I'm not very informed as far as Postgres goes. I have no idea where Postgres is as a product and what direction it's evolving and such. I think you may be in a better place to address that.
Yeah, yeah. So I'll throw on my 4 cents after inflation. general idea that I've got is I do agree. I think it's, yeah, SQL Server is a mature product. It's been a mature product. I don't know that it's ever been an exciting product in the sense of developer affinity that, oh my gosh, I just love this thing. It's not like a JavaScript Framework of the Month club. Databases rarely are. Even the hot databases. I guess something like SQLite or DuckDB, yeah, that's got a lot of developer cachet and, ooh, this is so neat. And in fairness, I do like SQLite and I do like DuckDB. But the general idea there is, oh, well, it's really easy for me to use versus this is such a cool product. And I believe that part of this is, the SQL language has been around for decades. It's been 50 plus year, or let's call it 50 years. I believe the earliest standards were late 70s and early 80s were kind of where you start seeing the product really begin to mature. But regardless, yeah, this is a mature, stable platform. And frankly, I think that's a good thing for storing data. That you don't want your data to be on a platform that will mysteriously disappear it, like, say, MongoDB. And yeah, I know I'm being mean to MongoDB unnecessarily because, they fixed most of those problems and introduced new problems, but then they fixed most of those and then introduced new ones, but then they fixed most of those. So it's nowhere near as bad as it was earlier on when everybody and their brother was pushing it as the next big thing for data platform technologies. That's an example of an exciting product. And for most cases with data, I think that there should be a bias toward boring, staid, stodgy technologies that work. The last two words really do matter a lot because boring, staid, stodgy doesn't necessarily mean that it works. There's a little bit of a nudge in priors that if this thing has been around for 50 years, the bias shouldn't be, oh, it's so old, get rid of it. The bias should be, it works really well. Why does it work really well? Can we adapt that? Can we understand it and hopefully create something that's marginally better? Or continue to use it as it is and maintain it? And so I do believe that bias does exist in major relational database players. That said, I think Microsoft and Oracle have spent a lot of time trying two different angles. One angle is let's make existing product a little better. So this is where you get to things like intelligent query processing. It's where you get data virtualization, where you get additional security options, basically trying to improve the quality of the core product. And the other side is incorporating some of the new hot features. And so a few years ago, that would have been bringing code to the data with something like SQL Server R services, or getting into what Oracle is doing around their vision and classification engines that can read against Oracle data. You do see some of that as well, where they're trying to make this hot and exciting to an extent, and with mixed success, I think is the best way to put it. I like it a lot, but I'm also the type of person who enjoys new things and trying out new things and seeing those appear and then writing books about it and nobody ever uses it. But so that is my bias. And by the way, Solomon, Happy New Year to you as well. So by contrast, I think Postgres is in that middle point of there is a lot of excitement from developers. Not as much as a DuckDB, certainly not as much as Mongo back in the day, but relative to the other major relational database players, this is the one that I think has the biggest draw from developer affinity. And part of that, I think, is in just how adaptable and extensible the platform is and how many different languages you can write extensions in and work in. So you can say, oh, well, I want to write my functions in C, and you can execute that against a database. Or I want to use P-SQL or PLSQL or some other language. I'm sure Python. I think Python's available. I want to say you could even do it in JavaScript if you're a real masochist, but I would have to check on that.
If you're a real masochist, I love that. I love that, Kevin.
But there's a lot of extensibility, and that does help make it a nice, interesting platform. I mean, the other thing is the licensing. This is actually, I think, the area where the major relational players have a tough challenge, where Oracle and SQL Server, I mean, at this point, DB2 isn't even a major player anymore. 10 years ago, they were on the edge of major player, already kind of dropping off. But today, I think they're a bit player. They're probably like the 5th or 6th major relational platform. And so Oracle and SQL Server, the two major ones that have real licensing costs. MySQL and Postgres, no real licensing costs, although you have real support costs. It's not free to manage those databases, and if there's a problem, you could get the free support on the developer list, but that's not necessarily going to solve your problems in an effective and efficient manner. So usually companies are paying for those support contracts, and so they're not paying for licensing directly, but they're paying for support. So it's not a difference of, well, this many thousands of dollars per core versus free. But even with those support contracts, yeah, the Postgres people are paying less. And there, I think, is probably the biggest challenge that SQL Server has, because it's cheap to spin up a Postgres instance. You don't have to pay for licensing for it. For the same instance it's running SQL Server, if you're in a production environment, you're paying for standard or enterprise edition. And that licensing can get expensive. I think in Azure, I believe it's something like $10 per core per day for enterprise licensing. I think that's about it. So for a 4 vCore system, a virtual machine with 4 cores, yeah, you're paying about $40 per day for licensing alone for that enterprise edition. And you do the math on that, that quickly adds up. You're talking $1,200 a month for licensing. That's enterprise edition. Standard edition is a lot cheaper, but I don't have that number right off the top of my head. I just did this recently for a customer and was working with them on licensing. Actually had to downgrade from enterprise edition to standard edition. It hurt me a bit inside, but I had to admit that for that instance, they weren't using anything that enterprise absolutely required. So, by the way, in case you ever need to downgrade from enterprise edition to standard edition, you actually have to uninstall the SQL Server box product and then reinstall it, because you cannot.
Hey, that was always like that, Kevin.
Yeah, exactly. It is.
Yeah.
For upgrade, it's easy. For downgrade, it's not easy. And I tried to couple that with changing from SQL Server 2016 to 2019 in the same move. That was a real mistake, because the way that you do it, at least that I saw, was you back up the master database so that you have all the logins, you have all the master stored procedures, you have everything that you've configured in master, and also back up MSDB. Pro tip, back up MSDB. So you do all of that stuff, and when you uninstall and reinstall SQL Server to get it to standard edition, you actually have to make sure that you're on the same patch level for your master database. Exact same patch level. Not just same version, not just same service pack, same patch level. And if you don't do that, you will get an error, which was a little bit annoying. The other thing, this actually saved me several times over the course of...
Back in the days, you even couldn't upgrade from standard to enterprise without uninstall and reinstall, if I recall. My memory serves me right. Even that was added in later years.
Huh. That is painful.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. Now, by the way, if you're on Azure, one thing I am going to point out here. This is an article that I wrote in 2022, almost 2 years ago at this point. And this actually was for an upgrade from 2016 to 2019. and I'll drop the link to that in chat. But the main part of the story was, hey, I need to get the license key for SQL Server 2019 for my Azure VM. It's properly licensed. The amount that gets paid is the same for 2016 versus 2019, but you don't. When you upgrade, you need a product key, and there's no product key that's readily available. So how do you get it? Well, for older versions of SQL Server, like 2005 to 2014, there was a blog post that covered how to grab the product key from an existing installation of SQL Server. And so there was a PowerShell function that could decrypt from the registry, if I remember right. Yeah, from the registry, the product ID. That doesn't work after 2014. It actually breaks in SQL Server 2016. And so what was really interesting is that if you ran this code on 2016, it would technically work. It would give you a 25-character product code, but it was the wrong code. That wasn't the actual code.
Oh my.
And fortunately, there was a person who had a version that did work, and I cleaned it up a little bit. So I've got a function here, a quick PowerShell function that reads from the digital product ID key, and it generates a product key, and that works for 2016, 2017, 2019 for sure. It probably works for 2022. I haven't tried it yet. But the general idea is that you call this function, and it will grab the product key for that installation of SQL Server. Now, where that becomes useful in Azure is I have 2016, I have 2019. Well, what I can do is I'm able to spin up a 2019 VM using create an Azure VM, and I can grab the product key for it. And if you spin up 20 of these VMs, I think the product key is the same. So I'm pretty sure it just uses the same product key for this is an Azure VM. I can grab that key. I can get the installation media for 2019, move it over to my 2016 box, and then I can perform an upgrade, and I have the product key for 2019. So again, there's no difference in pricing between the versions, so I don't feel any moral compulsion to say, oh, there's something that's wrong about this. I'm paying the same amount either way, and can mark in Windows that, or excuse me, in Azure that, yeah, this is now a 2019 VM. So this only works for SQL Server on Windows. There might be a way to do it for Linux, but I'm not sure. Nonetheless, this actually has been a pretty popular blog post, and I used it probably 4 or 5 times over the past weekend in the process of switching from Enterprise to Standard Edition. So I needed to get a Standard Edition code. I needed to get one for 2019 for the upgraded version. And also, they wanted me to keep SQL Server reporting services on 2017 instead of going to 2019 because they didn't like the new interface. So I had to find the 2017 Standard Edition product key as well. And all of this, the way that you would do it, you would spin up an Azure VM, you would connect to that Azure VM, you would run this function that gives you the product key. You can take that product key and apply it in a different VM for installation of or upgrade of SQL Server. And as long as you've set up all the licensing appropriately in the Azure VM, you've created a SQL Server VM, then it's prepared for you, and Microsoft doesn't get angry when they eventually do a license re-up and realize that you've got all these SQL Server VMs on your network that you weren't paying for. In this case, you're paying for it because you've set up the SQL Server VM. We're just changing which version of SQL Server it is. So I can stop that. This blog post saved my bacon a couple of times because I needed to grab that key. Like I said, 3 separate keys, one for 2016 standard, one for 2017 standard, one for 2019 standard. And so that required spinning up 3 VMs and doing it 3 separate times. But it worked. So if you ever have to do that, and it's not just an Azure thing, it's an anything thing. But hopefully, for other versions, if you're doing this on premises, you can grab the ISO from your software library, and that would actually have the key baked in. So you shouldn't have to do this for on-prem installations, but it was what I needed to do for Azure. So I don't remember if I have anything else to say about SQL Server contrasting with Postgres in terms of old or less exciting. I mean, I think they're both. Personally, I find them both exciting. I think SQL Server is an exciting product, but I also realize I'm weird in that regard, and that if you query 100 developers, most of them are going to find relational databases to be a very not exciting product, and many of them will find it to be a scary product that they don't understand because they don't have object permanence. That's why we have sessionless internet.
Hmm. No, I learned that the hard way. I have not worked with a ton of developers before, not the kind of developers I work with now before I came to this company. So
Right.
I literally learned from them why they are scared of SQL Server.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, object permanence jokes aside, although actually that is kind of part of the problem. Um, yeah, it is. It is a different mindset. It's a different process. You're not using the same language. I mean, I hear the reasons. I don't particularly find the reasons that compelling. But then again, I have the same qualms about JavaScript that a lot of developers have about relational databases. Don't like it, don't trust it, don't want it. Have to use
Hmm.
it. So
Hmm.
it's just, I guess, it's the way we roll. Speaking of the way we roll, this is actually a Shop Talk favorite. I'm going to share another article. This time around, this is on a blog. This is actually a fairly new blog. The post itself is from December 30th, and the fellow is a senior software engineer at Microsoft who spends most of the time on the front end of the web application stack. So, uh, there's that. But the blog post itself, it's called Why I'm Skeptical of Low Code. And this is a classic hobby horse for Shop Talk. We have talked repeatedly about low code and also skepticism of low code solutions and how they always feel fine until you actually have to deal with the consequences of it, in which case they all fall apart. So, what we're talking about in low code, this isn't necessarily something like, oh, well, using Copilot to generate code or using some other AI tool to generate code. This is instead, think low code as in SQL Server integration services or Informatica as your ETL jobs or Azure Logic apps or some drag and drop tool or a custom language that is trying to simplify a more complex language. And you have the wishes of low code, fast development time, low maintenance cost. You don't have to spend a lot of time hiring developers who can specialize in writing code. You just fill out the workflow and everything just works. But there tend to be problems. Power Builder, yeah, Power Builder is a great example of this. I've never used Power Builder, but yeah, that is a good example of it. So you want truly custom functionality the low-code solution can't handle. Because low-code solutions, if that still exists, I don't know. It might still exist. I mean, Cold Fusion still exists. A lot of stuff still exists. Although I would not. I was talking earlier about staid, stodgy technologies. I would not consider Cold Fusion as staid or stodgy. I just consider it old. Maybe I'm biased.
Hmm.
Yeah, Cold Fusion's the
How
other.
builder exists. I have a hard time. I have a hard time understanding how people still have code on Power Builder.
For the same reason that there's code in Algol and COBOL and Mumps and a bunch of other ones.
No, I mean COBOL was actually good for its times.
That's fair. Yeah.
I'm not sure I'd say that a power builder.
So Power Builder was bad even when it was common.
Yeah, I mean, it had this whole grid thing. If you work with Power Builder, you know why this grid thing that connected to the database, and you know, I worked a bit on it. In fact, some of the older projects I worked on before I started with Visual Basic were on Power Builder,
Hmm.
and oh my God, it was it was quite something. In those days, it was kind of fancy because development like that was a sort of a thing like where you could directly connect to the database and pull data down into the screen and then work around it. For that reason it was a bit fancy, but performance wise it was bad. It was really 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 bad.
Ah, that's fair. Solomon mentions there's still Windows 95 and DOS machines out there running code that nobody exists to maintain. Yeah, well, if you think about medical equipment or other capital equipment that typically has a long depreciation cycle, medical equipment, x-rays, quite often are still running on Windows 95 or Windows 98. There are a lot of machines that you look in and you say, oh my gosh, that version of Windows is very old. That version of Windows can vote. And hopefully it is not on the network, because if it is on the network, well, who knows what's installed on it. But in those cases, there's just a situation of, yeah, I bought that x-ray machine. I expect it to last for 30 years. I'm depreciating it over a 30-year period, so I'd better get 30 years of value out of it. And it was back when Windows 95 or Windows 98 or whatever was still a viable option for an operating system. And well, they're not going to rewrite the code, because if you rewrite that code, you rebuild it, you repackage it, then that's going to require updating the machine itself. It may require, depending on your industry, you may have to go through a regulatory authority. Like the FDA would have to recheck that your medical equipment functions as you claim that it does. That testing process can be anything from fairly simple to ridiculously complex, depending on the nature of the change and just how lucky you are. So you may have to go through up to years of additional testing to prove that your medical device still works the way that you expect it, depending on what kinds of changes happen. In a lot of cases, you can fast track that so that it's only a few weeks of testing versus years, like the initial tests could be. But when you also think about it can take years for a medical device to make it to market, well, if that was originally developed and Windows 98 was the perfectly reasonable operating system, by the time it gets out, Windows XP is out and Windows 98 is already considered old. But you can't really switch it over because that's what you built around. There are programs still running where the company that produced it are long gone and no source code is available. So some companies are kind of stuck. Yes, that's also a problem.
Mhm.
That
I
was.
wonder word perfect is around. I'm just saying.
Say again, Mala?
The word perfect, the first word processor that
Mm.
was around. Word perfect, or
Yes.
WP as it used to be called.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I enjoyed WordPerfect. I loved the
Yeah.
F7,
Yeah.
F8, F9, Control Shift F7 to bold or whatever. So,
And Fox Pro.
so I never got into Fox Pro, but there are people who still swear by Fox Pro, who still swear Fox Pro did nothing wrong.
I do. I do. I do. I do. I adore it. I do.
Yep.
Fox Pro is a lovely, very, very well written product. And I mean, it lost ground to VB when VB came out. But until then, it was it was a really nice product.
Yeah. And running that code on running old code on newer OSs might not function correctly. Timing could be off. Definitely. You could have different versions of DLLs. You could have API functionality changes in the operating system. You could have things just outright break or have more insidious lower end problems where clock speed changes affect your results, or maybe a change in the way that the random number generation occurs is something that you weren't expecting. And that's part of why for some industries you have to go through more thorough retesting, even for there's a different version of the operating system. Now, I think in many industries, companies will rely on that to too much extent. Like, no, you can't use any version of Windows after Windows Server 2012 because we haven't tested it. Okay, assuming that there is a problem, there is also a factor that if you're going to go with newer software, or excuse me, newer operating systems or updated versions of things, yeah, there is some requirement incumbent upon you for testing. But I think if the company's still around and if the product's still around, I think that there should be more of a push on those existing companies to make sure that their software, or at least to do the due diligence and checking to see if their software still works on newer versions of operating systems, and not rely on, oh, well, you're going to have to buy the next version of the software because that's the one that works on Windows 2016, Windows Server 2016. It's like, no, the old one still did. You just had to install it. But going back to the cases of companies gone, yeah, there are situations where companies have bought out the source code of a company going bankrupt simply because they needed that source code to maintain a third-party product that the company relied heavily on. So if you're in that situation, that's one way to get out of it. But if the company just goes, if that third party just goes under and you're stuck with, here's a tool that is really useful for us that our workflow relies on, and it is no longer available, you get into really dangerous waters. And I mean, this is the downside to the buy don't build mentality, where there's a downside to both mentalities. Buy don't build. The upside is you can specialize in the area where you actually know something and not have to spend a lot of time trying to reinvent the wheel in a whole bunch of different industries where you don't know what you're doing. However, the downside is when you buy and that company, the company you buy from does go under, you got problems. And migration isn't necessarily easy or sometimes even possible. So, yeah, you may be stuck running on an outdated operating system in a physical machine you can't get rid of that's under somebody's drawer at the office just because, well, we need this to be running on Windows XP because that's the only version that works on this. And frankly, we're not even sure we could reinstall it if we wanted to because it's a flaky solution. I've run into that story several times of the machine that happens to be under somebody's desk and everybody does their best to just keep it on and pretend that it doesn't exist because nobody wants to deal with the consequences because a non-insignificant portion of the company's value derives from this outdated solution that is hanging by a thread. It's the sword of Damocles for businesses. The other side, the build, don't buy side, has the advantage of, well, hey, you've got that in-house expertise of your products. You have built the thing. You know how it works. But the problem is that what you've built is probably garbage tier. And you've built a whole bunch of garbage tier stuff in a whole bunch of different areas. And your company is trying to rely on this, but none of it's actually working. So also, any update to anything takes 8 times as long because you don't have as much development effort as the rest of the companies in the world combined. So it's lose-lose. Everybody loses all the time.
Very true.
Life is full of trade-offs. That was one of the things. I had a computer science professor who loved to harp on that in computer science, everything's trade-offs. There's only one miracle that has ever happened in computer science. In computer engineering, the hardware side, you get miracles every day. You wake up, you read the news, you got another miracle. Computer science, we don't get any of them except for one. The one and only miracle that computer scientists have ever gotten is that reading pages in memory, the next thing to get read typically is on the same page that you have just read. So when you read a block of
That's
data,
funny.
that is his one
That's funny.
miracle. That the effectively cache hit rates are above 0. Because if you think about it, you have a whole bunch of data and all of it's written to disk, and you have to pull it up into memory. If cache rates were 0, if that memory was accessed completely arbitrarily, we could never cache anything in memory. It would always be slow. Whereas you could pull in this block of data, and most likely the next thing that is going to be accessed is in that block of data. That is our one miracle that we get. Everything else is trade-offs. Everything else is you can do A, but you got this downside to it. You can do B, but you've got this downside to it. There are no pure upside shots. That was a good professor. I liked him. He was very curmudgeonly, so I appreciated it. But okay, back
Very
to
what, Kevin?
curmudgeonly.
Oh,
Very much of a curmudgeon.
I don't think I could even say that word.
So back to Nick's article. Okay, you want truly custom functionality. The low-code solutions typically aren't going to handle that. They are intended for base case. Let me do the thing that covers 80% of the market, especially for smaller companies where you have a standardized use case. But once you get past that 80%, then you get into real pain. Significant, potentially impossible customization. Companies then have to choose, is 80% good enough, or do I need to hack the tool to make up for it? Solomon says, build, don't buy doesn't always provide the expected benefit when what is built is done in a language that the company moves away from. So, as an example, data access layer generator originally built in C++, which was years before Solomon worked with the company. Then they upgraded to SQL 2005, which had new data types. And some of those new types needed to get added to this data access layer generator. He's continuing, but I think the story is going to go on as, but nobody knew C++, or very few people knew C++ at the company. And of the people who did still know it, none of them really wanted to work on this tool. Yeah, I was initially told it wasn't possible. It was built in C++. Nobody there knew C++. It was too important a component to mess with. Yeah, yep, that's the punchline. And then eventually got rewritten into C#, and suddenly a lot of people knew it. But yeah, that can also be a risk where you've developed something in a language that nobody else knows. Hey, I've left F# code at the company. I mean, it's their fault they laid me off. And the rest of my team, who were the only other people who knew F# at the company. No, I take that back. There are a couple of people there who knew F# who were not on my team. But moral of the story, realize the consequences of the actions that you take. I guess. That's a harsh moral of a story, but I mean, it's a good moral that applies in a whole lot of cases. Yeah, eventually one person was brave enough and took it on. Usually you will find someone who is brave enough or dumb enough to accept a challenge. And then they really understand what that challenge meant and regret it instantly. So another problem with low-code solutions is, char and inchar were missing. That a little bit of a problem for a data access layer that doesn't have two of the, I guess they're not incredibly important data types. They were more important 30 years ago than they are today. I think they're fairly unimportant today, but not to the point where I'd advocate for getting rid of them. More of the idea that unless you're really trying to optimize table design, I think invarchar is just the way to go. And
Invarchar is just the way.
What's that?
I've not heard of that, Kevin. Invarchar is the way to go.
Oh, you haven't heard my Invarchar everywhere rants?
No, that I have.
Yeah.
I didn't realize it was a snarky thing you say. Okay, I got it now.
Yeah. I mean, that's my standard philosophy is Invarchar should be the default. It should be the standard. And you can make an argument, no, this needs to be char because here's why. And I'm okay with that. I don't think char or inchar or varchar are necessarily bad. I think invarchar should be the starting point, and if you absolutely need to ensure that this is two characters using the char data type or two Unicode characters using the inchar data type, then very well, that's fine. But start with invarchar. Just go with that. Drive from anywhere else. Though, yeah, I was bewildered at how much I had to fight to get these types accepted by our internal components so that we could use them in code that interacted with the app. It can be silly sometimes. And then as data types change, because that was also where var decimal was coming out. There were several other
Yeah,
data types.
2005 was a pretty landmark product.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. A lot of changes came out in that, and then 2008. I mean, just think of the date data type and the time data type. Date I use 15 times as often as time, but things that don't support the date data type, there were products 5, 10, 15, let's say 15 is too far, but 5 to 10 years after SQL Server 2008 that still struggled with the date data type because it's different from date time. Much less date time too. Just understand that as new types come out, you got to support them. But like Solomon's point, hey, when you're building this, make sure you do it in a language that remains in at least somewhat common use at the company, and that can be an argument in favor of, yes, there's a better language to do this, but we're going to do this in the less efficient or less effective language because we have 90 people who can troubleshoot this versus one person who can troubleshoot that. I can understand that from an architect's point of view, and I can recoil against it from a developer's or another architect's point of view. That, look, the problem is you can learn new languages. It's not that difficult. We're here because we know languages. It's one of the things that humans do pretty well is working with languages. And if you can't understand a language, I think most of that is being afraid to try or afraid to learn, where I'm stuck in my way of mediocre development in this one language from 15 years ago, and I'm just going to ride it till I retire. And so that I would argue it is better to push for a few languages. I wouldn't say, oh, well, we're going to have 15 different products using 15 different languages within this moderate-sized company, and every product team gets their own choice of languages that they want to use. I wouldn't go that far, probably. But I would also say standardizing on one language just because that's what we standardize on is a little self-defeating. Even in-house environments change. Yeah, and at the time it may have been a reasonable decision to use C++, assuming more than one person knew it at the time, which, given the size of the company at that point in time, I don't know. Maybe not. It could have been this was somebody's science fair project coded up in a language that they knew about, and there were only a couple of other people who were willing to admit they knew C++. I'm not willing to admit I know C++ because the C++ I know is from 20 plus years ago and has certainly changed a lot. So I don't know C++ anymore. Similar to shops that standardize on one relational platform from the start, but then merge with another company and have to migrate to a different one that nobody in the initial company knows. I have no idea what you would be talking about, Solomon. I have never experienced that in my life. It's going to pour one out for DB2 right now. DB2 usually is the victim in such situations, and it's a worthy victim. It is certainly worth getting rid of. So in the article, actually speaking of, we kind of touched on the next bit of the topic here. You implement a lot of functionality in a custom that in a low-code product that is a product-specific, or even it's a proprietary language, and now you have a very small pool of developers. So there are some low-code products that have their own templating language. And that templating language is fine. It's perfectly fine to use a templating language in a low-code product, as long as you realize that there's not going to be a huge market of developers or people who understand that language. So if you're using it, I would say in a standard way, in a normal way that is fairly well documented, then you can get by pretty well. And bring a new developer in. Here's the templating documents. Here's what we've done. Especially if there are good comments, if there's good notes, then it can work. But if you try to hack that low-code tool to do 100% of requirements, and you're building a bunch of custom code in a specialized language that hardly any people understand, now you have what is called the mumps problem. And if you're not that familiar with it, let me... Mumps is a terrible...
Mumps?
Yeah, mumps is based off of... I'm trying to remember which language it was based off of, but it is the...
It's a nerve illness. No, I'm just kidding. Really, there's an illness, terrible illness by that name.
Oh, yes.
Mumps.
Yes, it is a terrible illness, and it's also a perfect name for the language because the language itself is a terrible illness. So, for the disease, see mumps. For other uses, see mumps. This is the Massachusetts General Hospital Utility Multi-Programming System. So it's a high-level programming language that was developed at Massachusetts General Hospital, at MassGen, for managing hospital laboratory information systems. This is built on top of a prior language, and I'm trying to see what it was built off of, because I remember it being... built on a PDP-7, and there was another language that was built on top of, as I recall. But this is a real WTF language. This is the type of language that you throw people into because you hate people. It's been around for decades. And yeah, we can see in here that there are middleware vendors. They launched a product, Cache, in 1997. And so Mini-M. So there's in 2022, there's a new version of mumps, of the mumps language. Basically, it's been around for decades. And you can get into it. There's some of the language is really weird. Some of it is just you're dealing with hierarchical data platforms. So the type of thing that you would have seen pretty commonly in the late 60s, early 70s, and then just drags along. Built on deck, yeah. The original versions, if we come back up here in the 60s, was originally built on a PDP-1, and then the original mump system was built on a DEC PDP-7, and then they extended it to work on a PDP-9. So yes, built on DEC. So that's where it was for quite some time early on, the PDP series. But there were different versions that were available on Windows, DOS, Mac OS, and it's still around today. The language is still there. It is still painful. All operators have the same precedence and are left associative, which means that math is hard. 2 plus 3 times 10 is 50. So it's a little tricky. U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs was an adopter of the mumps language. Epic uses it. If Mike were here, I'm sure he could complain about that. But yeah, there are a lot of big companies in the health industry that have used mumps. Is this machine dependent? Good question. It probably is not at this point, I would assume, but I don't know. I've thankfully never had to administer anything in mumps. I've seen the code, but I've never had to write anything in mumps. My experience is mostly secondhand with respect to mumps as a language, and I would like to keep it that way. It's definitely not something on my to learn list. It is definitely on my not to learn list. If I run into an organization where I have to learn mumps, that's a good case for me to say, I'm in the wrong place. There are people who I imagine are happy with the language. I will allow those people to remain with the language. Let them specialize in it, because I would much rather not. It's definitely a counterexample for the let teams do whatever they want approach, because if a team comes in with this, I would say, let's not do that. So that's one of my counterexamples. However, if you come in with functional programming, you show me Haskell, let's roll. Let's go with it. So I have biases, of course. But yeah, you can run into an issue where if you're using low-code products, or frankly, even any relatively uncommon language, let's say Haskell, you have a small pool of developers, of Haskell developers, who you can bring in for the job. And you have to find maintainers who are specialized either in this low-code platform or in this uncommon language as kind of the alternative. So that is a risk to not just low-code, but also to uncommon but interesting languages. Haskell is probably one of them. I don't know that F#, that's kind of the in-between small, hard to find developers and reasonably okay to find developers. I think there are enough F# developers and enough .NET people who can understand the language that you could probably get away with it. It's a similar feeling that I have with Kotlin. A similar feeling to how Scala would have been 15 years ago. Let's say 20 years ago, because 15 years ago is right when Spark was starting to take off. The first Spark papers came out in 2009, so that would have been right around the time that you start seeing some take up. And prior to that, Scala was a secondary language, or probably a tertiary language. I don't think there were many common uses of Scala prior to Spark. The language, of course, existed, but it was uncommon to find developers for the language. It just happened to have several properties that were really beneficial to distributed data processing. Specifically, it's a functional programming language where you could manage side effects, prevent side effects from occurring. You could have distributed processing done very easily. You didn't have to worry about shared memory or shared assets or things overwriting other things. So it was quite convenient. Kotlin, another functional programming language in the Java space, that is another example of, yeah, it's a small language, relatively speaking, but it's picked up a lot. And now I don't feel that bad about developing in Kotlin, with the expectation that I could find people who could develop in it. But actual Haskell or Erlang or some of the other small languages, there are major benefits to some of them. Like, there's a reason that the Finnish telephone company developed Erlang and kept Erlang around for so long, and why it's a popular language for some things, but it's also really uncommon to use. Add .NET Data to your list of languages not to learn. And a proprietary IBM language for WebSphere Java App Server / Net Commerce Platform. It was painful. I'll believe it. I'll believe it. I have to pull this up just to see how bad it is. Net Data, last updated in October. Okay, well, used it back in 2000. Already a good sign. It is a server-side scripting engine that lets you create dynamic documents using live data from database management systems, including DB2, files and native applications, and RPG. RPG is the language I was trying to think of that was very closely related to mumps. RPG is going back. Are we just talking funny languages? Because Chef is the funniest. I've not had to use Chef, but scripting languages are their own interesting conundrum, because you end up with systems admins who swear up and down, I'm not a developer, I can't write code, I don't understand languages. And then you give them Bash and PowerShell and the Ansible language or Chef or having to do YAML
Totally
script.
guilty as charged, Kevin. Totally guilty there.
Yeah. And so they're like, oh, well, I can write this PowerShell script. And I say, PowerShell is a worse language than C# or F#. You could just learn C# or F#. No, I can't. That's a development language. I'm not a developer. And yet you wrote this 700-line PowerShell script that you're maintaining, and it's actually not bad code. Some of it may be, but yeah, let's assume that you understand how modules work, you understand how functions work, you understand how the class system works. PowerShell is just a wacky way of interacting with .NET code. So it is funny learning from systems administrators or the network administrators, the people who are on that side who swear up and down, I'm not a developer, I can't write code, I don't want to write code, I don't want to do any of that stuff. Like, you're writing code, you just are in denial. But I have not
Totally guilty there.
I have not learned anything about Chef. Ooh, Ruby. So, I see. Chef uses Ruby as its reference language. That's already something. So the language, at least back then, was too basic. It lacked a lot of functionality. It's considered rather common. But I had to write basic.
Way to find square root manually. Okay. Okay. It depends on the number, I guess.
Finding square roots manually, there is the Newtonian estimation method. But if you have to write a Newtonian estimation method in your language, and you're not a language designer, yeah, that's a problem. Square roots happen often enough. So Chef is hilarious, and I am reading through this. It looks like a lot of this is Ruby. So you're using a lot of Ruby operations, which, again, kind of goes back to that idea. I'm not a developer. Cool, you're writing Ruby code or Python code or PowerShell code or whatever code. You're a developer. Just time to admit it. Substring. Substring's another thing where if your end users have to build that, you've got a gap in your language. This last point, since we are talking data platform ostensibly, the underlying database structure is usually an absolute mess with these low-code solutions. Basically, I would say almost any third-party vendor product that you use will eventually have an awful database. It is very uncommon to look at a vendor database and say, this is well designed. I understand what this is. I can write queries against this, and it's meaningful. Instead, you have messes, user attribute 47. You have all kinds of this table has 500 columns, 90% of which are always null. Oh, well, that's because 8 versions ago we used some of those columns, and now we don't use them anymore, but we can't get rid of it because we need to make sure that the database is backwards compatible. All kinds of pain that you will see in vendor databases. Even SQL vendors who build products for SQL Server. You look at their databases like, yeah, your database design is not good. Even Microsoft, the company that builds the product, their databases are awful. Developers are building those
Oh
databases.
my, Microsoft. Oh, SCOM and SharePoint. No, SharePoint. Two big examples.
Yep.
Go look at.
Yeah. Well, if you look at Dynamics, anything Dynamics built is ugly. TFS or Visual Studio VSCS, whatever they renamed it to, VSTF, something. SCOM is a bad database, but the TFS databases were also typically really bad. Reporting services, not a great design. The SQL agent job databases in MSDB, the tables in MSDB are weird.
Yeah. MSDB, yeah, sure. Tables are weird.
Yeah.
Not the worst, but weird.
Yeah. And net.data was used to provide inline HTML processing like PHP, ASP, in-page blocks, or Cold Fusion, going back to that. So I couldn't use Java like the developer was using, or PHP, which was free and 1,000 times more powerful. Yeah, and so you end up with something really ugly. That's kind of the point of the story here, that just in a lot of cases, you'll end up developing some really ugly things, and it'll start out with, oh, well, it's low code. It's really easy. It's going to solve 90% of my problem. But it turns out that last 10 to 20% matters. But we've hit our hour. Mala's going to be on secret mission for a little bit. So next episode of Shop Talk won't have her around. But hopefully we'll get Mike and Tracy back. Otherwise, I will have to ramble alone for the next bit. I will, however, vamp so that Solomon can write the quick funny story, because I got to hold out for a funny story. While I'm doing that, one note, some of the new user group meetings are coming out for the month of January. So if you go to meetup.com/trypass, then you'll be able to register for those events. The second week of January, so that will be January 9th, we've got, let me double check, Armando Lacerda. That's right. Armando is going to talk to us about backup routines. So that'll be the Advanced DBA group. On the 16th, we have Andy Leonard coming down here from Virginia to talk about migrating SSIS to Azure Data Factory. That will be at Tech Systems. I will add the new address. So don't go to the current address. I'll add the new one once I get it. I'll send an email tomorrow and try to get it. But we'll go to the new place, wreck their new place instead of their old place. And then on the 23rd, Sally Daba will talk to us about Microsoft Fabric and metadata pipelines. So all of those are upcoming. Those are posted up on our meetup. The second and fourth Tuesdays, we are going to be online only. The third Tuesday, we will be in person only. So come on down for us for that the third week. And that one will not be online. So just to let you know up front. All right, we were tasked to build the updated website for the DB2 user group, the oldest DB user group as they claimed. It was then running in Lotus Notes, and I had to argue to switch to DB2 as the back end. There was some irony in that. I
remember the days when we had to argue with Microsoft for the days before. I think it was, I don't remember, before PASS started keeping, providing us with websites. to get databases, we had to argue with Microsoft for using Developer Edition, whether or not that was a production database. I remember that was a funny argument. Is the user group database a production database or not? Well, maybe we couldn't afford to pay for licensing, but I think some people went with access then. No, I don't remember. It was funny. But,
Yeah. No, that was when Microsoft was a lot more critical about what constituted developer edition. Like, oh, it's a production process. All right, where's the money? Well, it passes an organization. So, but if it's just a user group, yeah, that's even more of a dumb case. Yeah, Lotus Notes was mentioned here in the past. I had a friend of mine who was an architect at a state agency that we worked at, and he was a Lotus Notes consultant and swore up and down you could implement anything in Lotus Notes, and had implemented basically everything in Lotus Notes. It's like, yes, you can implement anything. It's going to be slow. It's going to be weird. It's going to be broken. But you know what? You can implement it, and then you could pay him to fix it and make it less slow and less broken. And so Solomon's got one more thing, so we're going to vamp for just a little bit longer. Hopefully you had a great new year so far, and we're just wrapped for this. But like I mentioned, come check us out next Tuesday. We will have our first meeting of the new year, and it should be a good one. Armando's a great speaker. I've seen this session before, as I recall, so should be good. By the way, in case you have never noticed before, we do actually have shoptalk.tripass.org. So I keep show notes of all the prior episodes. This is going back to 2020. And so if you are feeling like you're interested in seeing what we've talked about in the past, seeing some of the prior episodes, we've been keeping these notes for years. And granted, I was
Kevin's
better.
been keeping that. Kevin's the meticulous guy, so it's not a we.
Yeah, it's pretty much all me. But you can see us as we go along through this, how I've gotten a lot lazier about show notes. So the old days, really good show notes. It got a lot worse after that. But yeah, we've been doing this for almost
You
4 years.
you have zero reason to be guilty there, Kevin. Zero. I mean, it's a bunch of work, show notes.
It is. I think it's worthwhile afterwards if you can get
Yeah.
away with it. But yeah, I'm glad to do it. But we are going to wrap up. We're 8 minutes over. Fortunately, this isn't broadcast television, so they don't shut us off immediately. But with that, let's call it a night. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your evenings. And until we see each other in a future edition of Shop Talk or another meeting, everyone take care.
Bye, everyone. Thank you for joining us.